It was supposed to be an ordinary evening, the kind where silence feels safe. I had just finished folding the laundry when my phone buzzed. A message from my son. For a moment I smiled, expecting warmth, a question about dinner, a word of care. But when I opened it, the words cut through me like ice. You're not family. You're a guest. The air around me froze. My fingers trembled as I read it again and again. That night, I learned that love doesn't always die in loud fights. Sometimes it ends quietly, with a single line of text. I'm glad you're here, because what happened after that message changed everything. If you're watching this, please like the video, subscribe, and stay till the end. Because family isn't about who you raise. It's about who remembers you when the world forgets. The evening light was dim, the kind that makes shadows stretch across the floor. I was sitting by the window, sipping tea, watching the birds return to their nests. The room smelled faintly of soap and starch from the laundry I had folded. My phone lay beside me, silent, until it lit up with his name. For a moment, my heart warmed. I thought of all the times that name had meant love, care, safety. But when I opened the message, the warmth disappeared. The words glowed cold on the screen. You're not family? You're a guest. I stared at the screen for a long time, as if reading it again might change it. The letters were simple, the sentence short, yet it carried the weight of years. My hands shook, the phone slipping a little from my grip. The world outside my window kept moving. Children laughed, cars honked, the evening breeze whispered through the leaves. But inside my chest, everything had stopped. I tried to breathe, but even air felt heavy. That one message had erased decades of love, of struggle, of sacrifice. My tea had turned cold. I didn't notice it until a drop slid down the cup and touched my hand. That small touch brought me back to the room. The walls looked the same. The furniture hadn't moved, but something inside me had cracked. I wanted to believe it was a mistake, a message sent in anger. But deep down, I knew. Words like that don't come from a moment of frustration. They come from hearts that have changed quietly over time. From love that has turned into embarrassment. From children who have started to see their parents as burdens instead of blessings. I placed the phone on the table, screen down, but the words still echoed in my mind. You're not family. You're a guest. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a sentence. It was a door being closed in my face. It was the final proof that somewhere along the way, the child I raised had lost his way. The boy who once clung to my sorry, who cried when I left the room, now wanted me to believe I didn't belong. The air in the house felt different after that. It wasn't my home anymore. It was a place filled with echoes. I sat in silence for hours, watching the light fade into night. My body was still, but my thoughts kept moving. I remembered every small moment that had led to this. The cold replies, the missed calls, the forced smiles at family gatherings. They had all been small warnings, and I had ignored them because mothers always hope. Hope is both our strength and our curse. We keep believing that love will return if we just wait long enough. But love doesn't always return. Sometimes it leaves quietly, like a guest who forgets to say goodbye. As the night deepened, I turned on the lamp and picked up the phone again. I read the message one last time. It didn't hurt the same way now. The pain was still there, but it had changed shape. From disbelief to understanding. I realized that heartbreak, when it's deep enough, doesn't destroy you immediately. It carves you slowly, teaching you what kind of love is real and what kind only pretends. That text had done something I didn't expect. It didn't just wound me, it woke me up. I looked around my small living room, the photos on the wall, the sofa he had once fallen asleep on, the old clock that ticked steadily through our years together. Every object was a reminder of the life I had built from nothing. I had carried him through every storm, every hunger, every illness. I had turned my widowhood into a home for him. And now that home had been reduced to the word guest. It was cruel, but it was also honest. It told me where I truly stood in his heart. I did not cry. The tears had dried somewhere deep inside me long ago, replaced by something heavier, a tired understanding of human nature. Love doesn't die with distance. It dies when respect disappears. I thought of my husband, long gone, and wondered if he could see this from wherever he rested. I whispered to myself that maybe this was his way of reminding me that love, once given blindly, needs boundaries too. I turned off the lamp and lay on my bed, but sleep did not come. The message glowed in my mind, bright as a wound. I replayed his childhood in my thoughts. His first school day, the nights I stayed up sewing his uniforms, the times I walked to work so he could have bus fare. Every sacrifice had been a thread in the fabric of our bond, and with one message, he had torn it apart. The darkness around me thickened, but I didn't feel lost. I felt strangely awake. I realized that love had made me weak in the name of care. I had accepted disrespect as misunderstanding, neglect as busyness, and now betrayal as truth. But this time, there would be no excuses. This time, I would not wait for an apology that would never come. That message was not just a rejection. It was a revelation. It showed me who he had become and who I had allowed myself to be. I thought of the word guest again. A guest visits, stays for a while, and then leaves. Perhaps that was what I needed to do. Not to leave my home, but to leave the pain behind. To step out of the role of the silent mother who endures everything and into the woman who decides her worth. By the time dawn touched the curtains, I was still sitting on the edge of the bed. The light of morning didn't feel warm, it felt clean. The ache in my chest hadn't gone, but it had settled, like dust after a storm. I knew that day would mark the beginning of something I never thought I was capable of. The quiet kind of strength that doesn't shout, doesn't beg, doesn't explain. It simply acts. I stood up, straightened my bed, and made myself tea. The house was still. The clock ticked softly, marking the start of a new rhythm. As I sipped, I picked up my phone again and stared at the blank screen. I didn't reply to his message. I didn't ask for a reason. I didn't say I forgave him. I simply deleted it. Some words don't deserve a place in the story of your life. That day, I didn't lose a son. I lost an illusion. And sometimes that is a blessing disguised as heartbreak. I realized that love can indeed be erased with a single line. But dignity, once reclaimed, can rewrite an entire life. The years before that message were a lifetime built on love and struggle. I was a young widow then, standing at the edge of a world that felt too big and too cruel. My husband had left behind little more than memories and a small piece of land. But he had also left me a promise. A child, our son, and the reason to keep breathing when everything else had stopped. I carried that promise through every season, every hunger, every tear that refused to dry. I worked long hours in a small school, cleaning classrooms, washing blackboards, and sweeping corridors after the children left. The pay was small, but I saved every coin like it was gold. Some nights, I would come home too tired to cook, but I would still sit by my son's bed and watch him sleep, whispering to myself that everything would be worth it. The world outside didn't care about widows, but I didn't need its sympathy. I had purpose, and it smiled at me every morning when he woke up. When he started school, I made sure his uniform was always clean, his shoes polished, and his books covered neatly. I sold my wedding bangles to buy his first set of textbooks. I skipped meals to pay his tuition. Each sacrifice became a quiet act of devotion. I didn't see it as pain. It was love, the kind that doesn't need to be spoken because it breathes through everything you do. Every bruise on my hands was a prayer for his future. Every sleepless night was a promise that he would never feel the loneliness I carried inside me. As he grew, so did my hope. I watched him become bright, ambitious, full of dreams. He talked about becoming someone important, someone who could take care of me one day. I believed every word. Mothers always do. I would stand at the gate when he left for college, waving as long as I could see his figure disappear down the road. Each time he looked back and smiled, I felt life had paid me back for all those years of hunger and fear. The house I built for us was small but filled with warmth. Every brick carried my fingerprints, every wall his laughter. I planted jasmine by the window so its scent would greet him when he returned from school. I cooked his favorite meals even when my body ached from work. We didn't have much, but we had each other. The nights were peaceful, the silence comforting. I used to believe that love, when built with such care, could never turn into distance. But life changes slowly, like a shadow stretching across the floor. He became a man, and I became part of his past, something he had outgrown. The little boy who once asked me to sit beside him during storms now preferred silence when I spoke. I told myself it was normal, that children grow busy, that love doesn't fade, it just quiets down. I believed that until the day I realized I had mistaken distance for maturity and coldness for independence. Still, I gave without asking. When he got his first job, I was proud beyond words. I cooked sweets for the neighbors, told everyone that my boy had made it. When he bought a car, I felt as though the world had given me back the years I lost. I never asked for a share of his success. I only wanted a small place in his heart, a seat at his table, a voice that mattered in his world. I thought that was enough. I didn't realize that love needs to be nourished on both sides, or it starts to wilt quietly, like an unwatered plant. Even as his life grew larger, I made mine smaller to fit inside it. I gave up my room when he wanted to renovate. I sold my jewelry when he needed money for his wedding. I told myself that this is what mothers do. They keep giving, even when their hands are empty. The world praises them for their sacrifice, but forgets to ask if they have anything left for themselves. I didn't notice I had been fading. I was proud of my invisibility, believing it was proof of my strength. When his wedding day came, I cried with joy. I told myself that my job was done, that I could finally rest, knowing he had someone to share his life with. I stood in the corner of the ceremony hall, watching him smile, feeling like every hardship had led to that moment. I didn't know that day would also mark the beginning of my quiet erasure, the slow fading of my presence from his world. The new couple moved into the house I had built. I stayed, but it wasn't quite my home anymore. The furniture changed, the walls were painted, and even the curtains smelled different. I told myself it was fine, that change was natural. But sometimes I would wake up at night and feel like a stranger in my own room. Still, I smiled, because mothers are expected to smile even when their hearts ache. I continued doing what I had always done, cooking, cleaning, making sure everything ran smoothly. I stayed silent when they made decisions without asking me. I told myself love doesn't need permission. It simply endures. But endurance can become invisibility when no one notices your effort anymore. I didn't complain. I didn't want to be a burden. I just wanted to belong. Every morning, I prayed in the small corner of the house where my husband's photo hung. I told him our son was happy, that he had built a life we could be proud of. I told him I was okay. I didn't tell him about the loneliness that had started growing between the walls, the kind of loneliness that no prayer can fix. I thought time would heal it. But time only teaches. It doesn't cure. Sometimes when I looked at my son and his wife laughing together, I saw flashes of the boy I had raised, kind, caring, soft. But those flashes were fleeting. He was no longer the child who needed me. He had a new world now, one where I was slowly becoming a guest without realizing it, yet I held on. I thought patience could bring him back. I thought love could remind him of who he was. I didn't understand that love cannot reach hearts that have stopped listening. Every brick of that house carried my fingerprints, and every echo still whispered his laughter. But love built on memory is not enough when the present has forgotten you. I was still his mother, but in his world, I had already become a shadow. The distance didn't arrive suddenly. It came quietly, like fog creeping into a familiar street. One day, the laughter between us simply faded, replaced by polite silence. My son had changed, not in one grand moment, but in small, invisible ways that only a mother notices. His eyes stopped meeting mine when we spoke. His sentences grew shorter. His visits to my room fewer. At first, I thought it was work, the stress of new responsibilities. I told myself he was tired. That's what mothers do. We make excuses for the children who stop making time for us. After his marriage, the shift deepened. The woman he chose was polite in public, cold in private. She smiled when others looked, but her eyes carried calculation. I saw it, but I stayed silent. I didn't want to be the mother-in-law who complains. When she spoke to me, her tone was smooth but hollow, each word carrying a hidden edge. I told myself that time would soften her, that patience would win her over. But patience only feeds pride when it is mistaken for weakness. At family gatherings, she called me mother with sweetness, but her gestures told another story. She moved my things without asking, corrected my habits, changed the way the house looked. The old photographs disappeared from the walls. My husband's picture was moved to a corner shelf, half hidden behind a vase. I noticed it, but said nothing. The house still smelled of home, but its heart had changed. My name was still on the papers, but not in their conversations. My son watched this happen. Sometimes he looked uncomfortable, sometimes indifferent. He told me I worried too much, that I should relax and enjoy old age. But how do you relax when your memories are being erased one shelf at a time? I tried to talk to him once, but he brushed it off, saying, "Don't take everything so seriously." I smiled, but inside I broke a little. The child I had raised to value kindness was learning how to justify cruelty. The small things hurt the most. The way she served everyone first at the table and left me for last. The way my son didn't notice. The way their laughter filled the room while I sat quietly, invisible at the end of the sofa. Once, I caught my reflection in the window and realized I looked like a guest in my own home. The realization stung, but I swallowed it, hoping the feeling would pass. It didn't. It only grew stronger with every passing day. He began spending less time at home. Work, he said. Late nights, meetings, business trips. I stayed up sometimes, waiting to hear his key in the door. The sound that once brought comfort now came less and less. When he did come home, he was distant, distracted, carrying conversations that didn't include me. I became the background of his life, the furniture that's always there but never noticed. My love had turned into routine, my presence into noise. One evening, they returned from a trip together, laughing, their arms full of shopping bags. I stood by the door to greet them, smiling. They walked past me without a word. The gifts they carried were for others, friends, co-workers, her family. There was nothing for me. That moment was small, but it cut deep. I had spent years giving him everything, and now even a token of thought was too much. I realized then that neglect doesn't come with cruelty. It comes with forgetfulness. People stop hurting you because they stop remembering you matter. Days turned into weeks, and the distance thickened. He stopped asking about my health, stopped noticing when I skipped meals. I had become an extra presence, someone they had to accommodate out of obligation. The daughter-in-law started taking small decisions without consulting me, repainting rooms, changing locks, buying furniture. I told myself I didn't care, but I did. Every new object in the house was a quiet message that my time there was temporary. Sometimes, I would hear them whispering behind closed doors. My name would surface, followed by laughter or sighs. I never pressed my ear against the door, but the tone was enough to tell me what was said. There's a special kind of pain in hearing your name sound like a problem. I began spending more time outside, at the temple, in the garden, talking to neighbors who still saw me as myself. Inside my own home, I was fading, but outside, I still existed. The nights were the hardest. The house that once hummed with my son's voice now echoed with the emptiness of two people who had built a world that no longer needed me. I tried to pray, but my prayers turned into questions. Had I raised him too soft or too selfish? Had I loved him so much that he forgot love's weight? The answers didn't come. Only silence did. And that silence was louder than any argument could ever be. When festivals came, the difference became visible. The decorations changed. Modern, cold, without warmth. They didn't use the old lamps my husband and I had lit for years. My son said they looked outdated. The food tasted different too, full of spice but empty of soul. I ate quietly, smiled for the photos, and told myself that traditions die only when we stop holding them. I was still holding, even if I was the only one. I stopped waiting for invitations to join their outings. I stopped reminding them to include me in decisions. Slowly, I began to detach. It wasn't out of anger. It was survival. Loving someone who forgets you exist is exhausting. I started finding small joys in simple things. The sound of rain on the roof, the laughter of neighborhood children, the smell of my jasmine plants. I began rebuilding my peace one quiet day at a time. My son noticed, but not enough to ask. Once, he asked if I was okay, in a tone that didn't wait for an answer. I said I was. It was easier to lie than to explain that I was disappearing. He smiled, relieved, and went back to his life. That moment told me everything. He didn't want to know the truth. He wanted comfort. I gave him that, as I always had. The daughter-in-law started calling her parents more often, filling the house with laughter that didn't belong to me. I didn't mind. What hurt was the absence of my own son's laughter, the sound that had once been the heartbeat of my world. Now it lived elsewhere, in a home that didn't have space for me. I realized one evening, while folding laundry, that I no longer recognized his clothes. The brands were new, the styles modern, and I hadn't bought a single one. The simple shirts I used to mend had been replaced with things I had no connection to. Even his scent was different. Expensive. Foreign. It struck me then that even his skin no longer smelled like home. There was a time when he called me every day, asking about meals, about small things. Now, weeks would pass without a word. When he did call, it was short, mechanical, polite. The bond that once felt unbreakable had thinned into a thread barely holding. I knew it wouldn't take much for it to snap. But mothers don't cut threads. We wait until they dissolve on their own. Some nights, I would sit by the window, holding the old photo album. The pictures told stories that time had rewritten. There he was, a boy smiling with missing teeth, holding my hand at the beach, laughing under a small umbrella. I traced his face with my finger and whispered, "Where did you go?" The photo smiled back, frozen in a time when love didn't need reminders. The house had become a museum of my memories. Every wall carried echoes of what used to be: the birthday parties, the first paycheck celebration, the day he graduated. But those memories felt like someone else's life now. I had been part of his foundation, but he had built a roof that no longer sheltered me. That realization didn't make me angry. It just made me old. Love, I learned, doesn't always end with hatred. Sometimes it ends with indifference. The opposite of love isn't anger, it's forgetting. And I had been slowly forgotten. Not cruelly, just completely. That was the hardest part to accept. Still, every morning, I cooked his favorite breakfast. Not because he asked for it, but because love doesn't vanish as easily as attention does. I told myself that even if he never came back to eat it, at least the smell of it would remind the walls of what love used to be. Some nights, I would whisper to the photograph of my husband, telling him how quiet the house had become. I told him our son was fine, even when my voice trembled. I told him I was fine, even when my heart wasn't. Because that's what mothers do. They keep the truth soft so the world doesn't hear how hard it really is. And so the distance stayed. It didn't scream. It didn't argue. It simply existed. A wall built slowly by love that forgot how to stay. It happened on a quiet morning, the kind that begins with soft light and small hopes. I had been awake since dawn, making breakfast for one. The smell of tea filled the kitchen, and the sound of birds outside reminded me that life still moved, even when love slowed down. I looked at the clock, waiting for a call that never came. He hadn't visited in months, but my heart still carried his timetable, like a prayer whispered out of habit. That day, I decided to send him a small message. Nothing demanding, just a mother's thought. I typed slowly, asking if I could come for lunch, if I could see him and his wife, maybe bring some sweets. My fingers hesitated before pressing send, as if they already knew what waited on the other side. The reply came sooner than I expected. Just one line, cold, sharp, final. You're not family. You're a guest. For a few seconds, I stared at the screen, unable to breathe. My heart didn't break in one loud crack. It shattered quietly, piece by piece. like thin glass under pressure. My hand trembled so much that I almost dropped the phone. I read the message again, hoping my eyes had made a mistake. But the words didn't change. They stood there, bold and cruel, staring back at me from the blue glow of the screen. I looked around the room. The same walls that had watched him grow, the same chair where he had once sat doing homework, the same window where I had waited every evening for him to return home. Everything around me still belonged to our memories, but suddenly none of it felt like mine anymore. The house turned colder, the light dimmer. My heartbeat felt heavy, slow. I didn't cry right away. Tears take time when the wound runs too deep. I sat on the edge of the bed, holding the phone, my breath shaking. Every word replayed in my mind, not as sound, but as pain. "You're not family." I whispered it under my breath, tasting the bitterness of each letter. It wasn't just rejection. It was exile. I hadn't realized love could cast you out like that. The hours passed, but the sting didn't fade. I tried to distract myself, cleaned the kitchen, watered the plants, folded the sheets. But even the smallest things reminded me of him. The tea mug he used to drink from, the coat I had mended, the birthday card still stuck to the fridge. Everything whispered the same question. When did love become something that needed permission to exist? That evening, the phone lit up again, but this time it was a message from a neighbor, asking if I was coming to the community event. I didn't reply. I didn't have the strength to pretend I was okay. I sat by the window, staring at the sky. The sunset looked the same as always, but it felt colder. I realized heartbreak isn't just for lovers. It's for mothers too, when their children stop seeing them as home. I didn't tell anyone about the message. Some wounds don't need witnesses. I kept it to myself, tucked deep in the quietest part of my heart. I couldn't even bring myself to delete it. I needed to remember it. Not to punish myself, but to stay awake. Sometimes, pain is the only thing that reminds you of your worth. That night I looked in the mirror and saw the years in my face. The wrinkles carved by worry, the silver in my hair earned from sacrifice. I thought of all the nights I had spent praying for him, feeding him, holding him. And now, all that history had been erased with one sentence. Love, it seemed, didn't need reasons to vanish. It just needed pride. I sat down on the bed and clasped my hands together. I didn't beg God to change him. I only asked for strength. Strength to stay calm, to keep my dignity, to not let bitterness take root. Because hatred is easy. Forgiveness takes courage. I knew I would never forget those words, but I also knew I couldn't live my life defined by them. The house felt empty, yet I felt strangely awake. Pain, when it's deep enough, sharpens the soul. It strips away illusions, leaving only truth. I realized I had spent my whole life giving love without limits, and in return, I had received silence. But silence can teach. It can harden steel where softness once lived. I understood that day that I could no longer live waiting for respect that wasn't coming. I didn't block his number. I didn't reply either. My silence became my answer. Some people need to face the echo of their own cruelty. I knew one day those words would return to him, not through anger, but through consequence. Because love, when betrayed, doesn't vanish. It waits for its justice in time. As the night deepened, I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders and sat by the lamp. The glow fell softly on my hands, and I noticed how thin they had become. The same hands that once held him when he was small. They still trembled slightly, but they weren't weak. They had held a life together. They had raised a man, and now they would rebuild peace. I folded the phone away in a drawer and whispered to myself that I would not chase love anymore. If my son saw me as a guest, then I would behave like one, quiet, polite, and temporary. I would not demand my place. I would let time remind him what he had lost. I didn't sleep much that night, but when dawn arrived, something in me had shifted. The grief was still there, but beneath it was a calm I hadn't felt in years. The kind of calm that comes when you finally understand your own worth. I had spent decades defining myself by motherhood, but now I knew I was more than that. I was a woman who had survived loss before, and I would survive this too. By morning, I made a promise to myself. I would not argue for my place. I would not cry for what was gone. I would let silence speak for me. Because time, I knew, has a way of making people hear the words they once ignored. That message, cruel as it was, had given me something I didn't expect: clarity. And clarity, I learned, is the first step toward freedom. The morning after that message, I woke up before sunrise. The world outside was still gray, quiet, untouched. I sat by the window, wrapped in my old shawl, feeling the chill settle into my bones, but inside me, something new had awakened. Not anger, not sadness, but clarity. Pain has a way of cleaning the heart, of stripping away everything that doesn't matter. And in that quiet hour, I understood what did. I had spent years defining my worth by my son's love. I had believed that his happiness was my success, that his smile was proof that I had done something right. But when he called me a guest, that illusion died. Guests do not build homes. Guests do not starve so their children can eat. Guests do not stay awake through fevered nights praying for miracles. No, guests arrive and guests leave. I realized then that if he saw me that way, then I had nothing left to lose. I walked to the small cupboard in the corner of my room. Inside was a file wrapped in brown paper, tied with a faded red thread. It had been years since I last touched it. My hands trembled slightly as I pulled it out. It contained the will, the one I had written when I first bought the house, and some savings had finally gathered over the years. My son's name was written there, in neat letters, as the sole heir. Every brick, every coin, every piece of jewelry I had ever saved for him. It had been my way of saying thank you for being my reason to live. Now it felt like a mistake carved in ink. I placed the file on the table and stared at it for a long time. The papers looked innocent, but they carried the story of my life, of faith, of love, of blind trust. I traced my name at the bottom of the page, the signature that once felt like a blessing. I realized it was time to change it, not out of spite, but out of self-respect. If he could erase me with one message, then I had the right to rewrite my ending. That morning, I made a decision so calm it almost scared me. I would not shout, I would not cry, and I would not confront him. Words can be denied, documents cannot. If he saw me as a guest, then he would not inherit a home. He would inherit a lesson. Guests don't receive legacies. They leave when the visit is over. I brewed tea the same way I had done every morning for years, but this time it tasted different. Not bitter, but strong. I drank it slowly, each sip grounding me in quiet strength. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in years. My lawyer's. He had helped me draft the original will. His voice was older now, but kind as always. I told him I wanted to make a few changes. He didn't ask why. Perhaps he could hear the firmness in my tone. He said he would prepare the documents. After hanging up, I sat still for a while. The decision didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel peaceful. Peace doesn't come from revenge. It comes from reclaiming your dignity. I wasn't punishing my son. I was releasing him. Releasing him from the illusion that love can be taken for granted forever. Releasing myself from the endless waiting that had turned my life into an echo. Later that day, I opened my old trunk, the one that held my memories. Inside were photographs, letters, and small keepsakes from my past. Among them was a picture of my husband holding our baby boy. His smile was wide, his eyes full of pride. I traced his face and whispered softly, "I did everything I promised you. Now it's time to keep one more promise, to myself." I folded the photograph back into the trunk and felt a strange lightness in my chest. I realized that forgiveness doesn't always mean letting people stay. Sometimes it means setting them free, even if they never come back. I was no longer the woman who waited by the phone. I was the woman who had built a life out of nothing and could rebuild it again without anyone's permission. That evening, I sat in my chair, listening to the faint sounds of life outside. Children laughing, dogs barking, the hum of traffic in the distance. The world was moving forward, and so was I. I took out a pen and a small notebook. On the first page, I wrote a single line. Respect is the only inheritance that lasts. I closed the book and placed it beside the will file. It was a reminder of why I was doing this. Not to hurt him, but to protect the dignity I had spent a lifetime building. When night came, I didn't feel lonely. I felt steady. My house was quiet, my heart calm. The pain was still there, but it no longer controlled me. I had found my strength in the very place I had lost my peace. There is a kind of power that comes only after heartbreak, the power to choose yourself. That night I slept soundly, knowing tomorrow I would rewrite the story he thought he had ended. The next morning, I ironed my sari, tied my hair neatly, and prepared to visit the lawyer's office. As I stepped out of the house, I looked back once, not with sadness, but with acceptance. The home I had built with love would soon carry my name, not as a memory, but as a message that no child, however successful, has the right to turn love into humiliation. I walked down the familiar lane, each step steady, each breath deliberate. The world looked the same. The morning vendors shouting, the smell of bread from the bakery, the same old sun climbing over the rooftops. But inside me, everything was new. I was no longer a mother waiting to be loved. I was a woman reclaiming her story. When I reached the lawyer's office, he smiled warmly, surprised to see me after so long. He brought out the old documents, dusted them off, and asked what I wanted changed. I told him clearly, remove his name, include the orphanage instead. He nodded slowly, his eyes soft with understanding. When he asked if I wanted to leave a message with the change, I smiled. Yes, I said quietly, just one line. He handed me a pen. I took a deep breath and wrote in my handwriting, shaky but strong. If you see me as a guest, remember, guests don't inherit homes. They leave when the visit is over. I placed the pen down and signed my name beneath it. The sound of that signature felt like a door closing gently. Finally, after years of being left open to hurt. When the papers were sealed, I felt no triumph, no bitterness, only peace. Revenge shouts, dignity whispers, and I had learned to speak softly again. On my way home, the sky turned golden. The streets buzzed with life, but I walked through them like a ghost reborn. My body was old, but my spirit was unbroken. I thought about all the women who live like shadows in their own homes, silenced by the fear of being unloved. I wanted them to know that silence can be powerful when it carries truth instead of submission. That night, I placed the new will back into the same cupboard, beneath the same red thread. But it no longer felt like a secret. It felt like freedom wrapped in paper. I made myself a cup of tea and watched the moonlight spill across the floor. I whispered softly, "It's done." And for the first time in a long while, I smiled. Not because everything was fine, but because I had finally learned that peace is not given. It is chosen. The next few days passed slowly, like pages turning in a book I already knew the ending of. Each morning began with the same silence, the same sunlight falling through the curtains, but my heart was no longer heavy. I moved through the house like someone clearing dust from old memories. Every object I touched had a story, and I was finally ready to decide which stories would stay and which ones would leave with me. I began with my husband's photograph. I cleaned the frame, polished the glass, and placed it in the center of the living room. Again! It had once been pushed aside, hidden behind new decorations, but not anymore. That photo belonged to the foundation of this home. I set it where it could be seen, like a quiet witness to everything that had been endured and reclaimed. For the first time in years, the house began to look like mine again. Then I took out the wooden trunk that held my belongings. Old jewelry, a few documents, and letters I had written to myself over the years. I opened each envelope carefully, reading my own handwriting. Words I had forgotten I once needed to hear. Promises to stay kind, to stay patient, to never let bitterness grow. I smiled sadly, realizing how hard I had worked to keep those promises, even when no one noticed. I made a list in a small notebook. The things I wanted to keep, the things I would give away, and the things I would leave behind. Every decision felt symbolic, like tidying up not just my home, but my soul. I set aside the sari my husband had gifted me on our anniversary, the small bangles from my youth, and the silver anklets I had once worn during festivals. I packed them neatly in a small box labeled to be donated. When the lawyer called to confirm the new will was ready, I told him I would come the next morning to finalize it. But before that, there was one more thing I needed to do. There was an orphanage near the edge of town, a place I had donated to occasionally, never expecting anything in return. I decided to visit it that evening. The road there was narrow and dusty, lined with banyan trees that cast long shadows. The sound of children playing reached me before I even saw the gate. When I stepped inside, dozens of small faces turned toward me, eyes full of laughter, hunger, and innocence. The caretaker, a kind woman in her 50s, greeted me warmly. I watched the children for a while, their simple joy reminding me of my son's younger days. For a moment, I felt the ache in my chest ease. They ran around freely, sharing food, helping each other, asking no one for permission to belong. I realized then that love had no bloodline. I spent hours there, reading stories to the children, helping them with their evening prayers. When it was time to leave, I spoke to the caretaker quietly. I told her about my new will. She looked at me with surprise, then gratitude. But I told her this wasn't charity. It was balance. The love I gave to someone who forgot it would now feed those who still needed it. It felt right. It felt just. That night, when I returned home, the house was dark and still. I turned on the lamp and looked around. It no longer felt lonely. It felt clean, like a space ready for peace. I sat by my desk and wrote a letter to accompany the will. It wasn't long, just a few lines written in careful script. Respect matters more than blood. The heart that forgets kindness will one day remember loss. This isn't revenge, it's remembrance. I folded the letter neatly and placed it inside the file. Then I signed my name again at the bottom, firm and unshaken. It struck me how different this signature felt compared to the first one I had made years ago. Back then, I signed with love. This time, I signed with wisdom. Both came from the same heart, but one had learned its lessons. The next day, I visited the lawyer's office to deliver the final version. The papers were ready, the signatures aligned, the seal pressed firm. When it was done, I sat quietly for a few minutes. I didn't feel proud or angry, just free. I thanked him, paid his fee, and walked out into the sunlight. The sky was wide and clear, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel small beneath it. Back home, I brewed tea and sat near the open window. The wind carried the scent of jasmine, the same flowers I had once planted when my son was a child. They still bloomed faithfully, even when no one watered them regularly. I smiled faintly, realizing I had been like those flowers all along, growing quietly, even when forgotten. I began rearranging the house in small ways, not to erase memories, but to reclaim space. I moved my chair back near the window, placed my books on the shelf, restored old photos to the walls. Each act was a declaration. I still belong here. I wasn't a guest. I had built this home from the soil of my sacrifices, from the years of my devotion. The silence that once hurt now healed. It was no longer emptiness. It was calm. Over the next few weeks, I found peace in routine. Morning prayers, walks to the market, brief chats with neighbors who still called me Amma. I no longer looked at my phone expecting a message. I no longer waited for footsteps that didn't come. I had replaced hope with acceptance, and that made all the difference. Sometimes, I wondered if he would ever realize what he had done. If one day he would look for me and find only the echo of his own choices. But those thoughts didn't bring pain anymore. They brought peace. Because when you stop needing an apology, you start healing. As the days passed, I wrote small notes to myself and left them around the house. On the kitchen counter, one read, "You are enough." On the mirror, "Dignity is your reflection." On the bedside table, "Peace is the reward of letting go." These were my reminders, not to forget him, but to remember myself. I kept the letter to my son in the will short and clear, written in the same calm tone I had once used to teach him right from wrong. It wasn't written to wound him. It was written to awaken him. It said, "I once gave you everything I had, but love without respect is debt, not gift. The house, the savings, the name, they now belong to those who still understand kindness. One day, you'll see this not as punishment, but as lesson." When I sealed that letter, I felt as though a weight had lifted from my shoulders. I wasn't angry anymore. I was simply done. Done with waiting. Done with explaining. Done with shrinking to fit someone else's comfort. Peace had returned, Not because I won, but because I stopped fighting for what had already been lost. That evening, I stood at the doorway, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and red. The wind was cool against my face. For years, I had prayed for his happiness. Now, I prayed for his wisdom, because happiness without gratitude turns into arrogance, and arrogance always finds its way back to humility. I turned back inside, closed the door gently, and whispered, "It's all in order now." And it was. My heart, my will, my world, all finally in order. The months that followed were the quietest of my life. The days began and ended without much difference, as if time itself had softened around me. I no longer waited for phone calls, no longer looked at my screen hoping to see his name. My mornings belonged to the sun again, to the sound of sparrows nesting near the window, to the small rituals that made me feel human. Silence became my company, and slowly, I learned it was not the enemy I once feared. In the early weeks, I kept expecting him to come, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of habit. I imagined footsteps on the porch, the sound of his car in the driveway, a knock at the door that would undo the ache of his words. But none of it came. Each day that passed without his presence became a reminder that I had finally been erased from his daily world. Yet strangely, the pain began to dull. It no longer felt like an open wound. It felt like a scar that had accepted its place. His wife, I heard from neighbors, was busy hosting gatherings and dinners. Their house, once filled with my laughter, now belonged entirely to her design. New furniture, new colors, new rules. I didn't visit, and they didn't invite me. The distance between us had turned from emotional to physical, and I had stopped trying to cross it. Sometimes, people think peace means being together. I learned that peace can also mean staying away. I kept myself occupied. I cleaned the garden every morning, pruned the jasmine bushes, and repainted the small bench under the tree. I began attending community prayers at the temple again, sitting with women my age, sharing smiles that needed no explanations. They spoke of their grandchildren, of festivals, of little things. I listened quietly, letting their stories fill the space inside me that used to echo with loneliness. Life outside my pain was still happening, and I chose to step into it again. Some evenings, I would visit the market, not because I needed much, but because the noise and color reminded me that I still belonged to the living. The shopkeepers greeted me kindly, calling me Ama, offering discounts I didn't need. Those small gestures stitched something inside me back together. Kindness from strangers often heals the wounds left by those you love. Months passed and the seasons changed. The summer heat faded into cool winds and the smell of rain returned. My body grew weaker. With time, age has its own quiet demands, but my heart grew lighter. I no longer carried the weight of waiting. There was freedom in that. Freedom in not checking the phone, in not rehearsing conversations that would never happen. I started keeping a journal by my bedside, writing one line each night before sleep. You survived another day without needing anyone's permission to exist. The neighbors began to notice the calm in me. Some said I looked younger. Some said they admired my strength. I smiled at them, but I knew it wasn't strength. It was surrender. The kind of surrender that doesn't mean giving up. It means giving in to life, accepting its shape as it is. I still kept the house clean, the bed made, the kitchen warm. There was something sacred in ordinary work. Cooking rice, folding clothes, sweeping floors. These became acts of peace, Reminders that control still existed in small things, even when bigger things had slipped away. Every pot I placed on the stove, every corner I dusted, whispered one truth: I was still here. Sometimes I would dream of him, not the man he had become, but the boy he once was. In my dreams, he laughed freely, calling out for me, holding my hand. I would wake up smiling, then feel the familiar ache return, not as pain, but as memory. Memories, I learned, are kinder than reality when they stop demanding to come back. The orphanage sent me letters now and then, little updates about the children, drawings they made for Auntie who helps us. I kept those drawings pinned on the wall, colorful scribbles of houses and hearts. They made me smile more than any gift my son had ever brought. I didn't need blood to feel love. I only needed sincerity. Occasionally, people in the neighborhood would mention my son, saying they saw him on the news or at a social event. I would nod politely and change the subject. I bore him no ill will, but his name no longer stirred my heart. It was just a name, not a wound. I had let go of the version of him that existed in my memories. What remained was a quiet gratitude that I had lived long enough to see the truth clearly. The daughter-in-law, I heard, often joked about how old people take things too personally. Her words reached me through gossip, but I didn't flinch. Let them laugh. Laughter built on arrogance always fades when life teaches humility. I didn't need to defend myself. The years would do that for me. When festivals arrived, I celebrated them alone but without sadness. I lit the lamps, cooked a small meal, placed flowers at my husband's photo, and prayed not for reconciliation but for peace. Peace for them, peace for me. My prayers had changed. They were no longer pleas, they were goodbyes spoken softly, without bitterness. My health began to decline slowly, the way age creeps in unnoticed. Some days I woke with aches that stayed till night, but I didn't complain. Pain had been part of my life for too long to scare me now. I learned to live gently, to rest when my body asked, to smile even when the breath came shallow. Through those months of silence, I realized something profound, that love, once betrayed, doesn't disappear. It simply changes form. It becomes compassion for others who suffer the same. It becomes wisdom for those who still hope blindly. It becomes a lesson you no longer need to teach anyone because you've already lived it. I found myself speaking to my husband's photograph more often again. Not with sadness, but with calm conversation. I told him the house was quiet, that the jasmine still bloomed, that the boy we raised had found his own path, even if that path no longer crossed mine. I told him I was proud, not because of what I gained, but because of what I didn't lose, my grace. The silence of those months was not empty anymore. It was full of understanding, patience, and the soft rhythm of healing. I realized that sometimes the most powerful answer you can give to cruelty is peace. Not the kind that hides, but the kind that shines quietly until the world has no choice but to notice. And so, I lived. Not waiting, not hoping, but simply living. With open curtains, with blooming plants, with peace that no one could take away. Sometimes, peace is the loudest answer of all. It began with weakness, the kind that starts quietly. A skipped step here, a heavy breath there. I told myself it was just age, that rest would fix it. But one morning, I couldn't stand without holding onto the wall. The room spun, and my hands trembled so badly that the cup slipped from my fingers and shattered on the floor. The sound echoed through the house like a reminder that even glass is stronger than the human heart. I sat down slowly, pressing my hand against my chest, and realized something was wrong. The neighbors found me hours later, pale and faint, and insisted on taking me to the hospital. I didn't resist. There comes a time when you stop arguing with life and simply let it carry you. The drive was quiet. I watched the world pass through the window, thinking of how small everything looks when you're on the edge of something unknown. The hospital smelled of medicine and disinfectant, but there was a strange comfort in it. Like structure, like order, like something still working when so much inside me had stopped. They ran tests, whispered words I couldn't catch, and finally told me I would have to stay for observation. I didn't ask for details, I just nodded. The white sheets, the beeping machines, the slow rhythm of footsteps in the corridor, they all blended into a kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. I lay still, listening to my own breathing, wondering if this was how endings sounded. Not loud, but steady, almost kind. Word of my hospital stay reached my son. He arrived 2 days later, not because of love, but because duty makes even cold hearts move. When I saw him walk in, I didn't feel anger. I felt nothing. The distance between us had grown too wide to cross with apologies. He looked uncomfortable, standing by the bed, his eyes darting around as if searching for the right expression to wear. I smiled faintly, not out of warmth, but out of habit. Love leaves traces, even when it's gone. He brought flowers, expensive ones, their scent too heavy for the small room. He spoke softly, saying things that sounded like care but felt like obligation. I nodded, letting him believe that time had softened everything. Inside, I knew that this moment wasn't about reconciliation. It was about truth. The quiet kind that arrives when everything else has been said and done. When the nurse came in with documents for my treatment, she asked for a family signature. My son looked startled. I handed him the papers calmly. He didn't read them. He never did. He signed where I pointed, distracted, eager to leave. I thanked him softly. That signature, careless and quick, sealed what was already written, the shift of everything he thought belonged to him. For the next few days, I stayed in that bed, surrounded by machines that hummed like lullabies. The nurses were kind, gentle in their work. One of them, a young woman, often smiled at me, calling me Grandma. It was a simple word, but it carried more love than I had heard in years. I realized then that family isn't always made by blood. Sometimes it's made by kindness, by presence, by small gestures that ask for nothing in return. At night, when the lights dimmed, I thought about my life. The years of sacrifice, the love given freely, the loneliness that had followed. I wasn't bitter. I had no energy left for that. I was only grateful that I had found peace before my last breath. Some people live their whole lives chasing peace and never find it. I had found mine in silence, in truth, in acceptance. I knew my time was nearing. The doctors didn't have to say it. I could feel it in the way my body moved slower, in how the nights grew longer and the mornings shorter. But I wasn't afraid. I had already faced the worst pain a mother could, being forgotten by her own child. Death, in comparison, felt gentle. Each day my son came for a few minutes, sitting by the bed, checking his watch, pretending to care. I didn't hate him for it. People love as much as they are capable of, and some hearts simply don't have the depth to hold guilt. I let him talk, nodded when needed, and smiled when silence filled the air. That smile wasn't forgiveness. It was freedom. I was no longer waiting for him to understand. I had already forgiven myself for believing he ever would. One afternoon, when the nurse stepped out and the light from the window bathed the room in gold, I whispered a prayer, not for recovery, but for closure. I prayed that when my time came, it would be quiet, without pain. And I prayed that one day, when he stood in this house again, he would understand the cost of the love he took for granted. That evening, before he left, I asked him gently to call my lawyer and keep my papers safe, just in case. He nodded, absent-mindedly agreeing. He didn't know that in those files lay the truth of my love and the lesson his pride had earned. The will, sealed and waiting, carried the voice I no longer needed to speak. Days passed, and I grew weaker. The nurses became my family in those last moments, bringing soup, holding my hand when pain struck, adjusting the pillow so I could breathe easier. Their kindness filled the space where his care should have been. I didn't resent him for not staying longer. Sometimes you learn that love isn't meant to return in the same form it was given. On the final night before they discharged me, I stayed awake watching the moon through the hospital window. The city lights shimmered below, the same city where my son lived, near, yet worlds apart. I thought of all the mothers who live invisible lives loved only when convenient. I wanted to tell them that peace is still possible, even after betrayal, even after loneliness. You just have to stop waiting for the apology that will never come. When morning came, I signed my discharge papers with steady hands. I knew my time wasn't long, but that didn't matter. I had done what needed to be done. The truth was already written, sealed, and waiting. The story had already shifted its ending. He drove me home, talking about the weather, about work, about things that didn't matter. I smiled faintly, watching the road ahead. He thought he was bringing me back to the house that would someday be his. He didn't know he had already signed it away. I wasn't angry. I wasn't triumphant. I was simply at peace. The story that began with his rejection would end with my dignity. And in that quiet realization, lying in that white bed, I understood something deeper than pain. That sometimes justice doesn't come from courts or revenge. It comes from truth written in silence and sealed in paper. The day came quietly, like any other. No storms, no warnings. But that morning carried the weight of endings. The lawyer called early, his voice calm, telling my son and his wife to come to his office for the reading. They agreed, thinking it was routine, a simple formality, before moving forward with what they believed was theirs. My body was gone by then. The bed where I had taken my last breath was empty. But my words were waiting. The lawyer's room smelled of old paper and ink. The curtains were drawn halfway, sunlight spilling in stripes across the floor. My son sat beside his wife, restless, scrolling through his phone, impatient for the ceremony of inheritance to end. In his mind, the outcome was already written. The house, the land, the savings. Everything would flow into his hands as easily as he once took my love. The lawyer began reading. His voice was low, steady, professional, carrying the rhythm of finality. The first part was ordinary. Property details, documents, signatures. My son nodded absently, not listening. But then the lawyer paused. The room seemed to grow still. The next lines were different. They carried my voice, my decision, my truth. It said that all my property, my house, my savings, and all belongings of sentimental and financial value were to be donated to the orphanage I had supported during my lifetime. It said that none of it would go to my son. It said that the inheritance he once took for granted was no longer his to claim. My words, simple and quiet, fell into the silence of that room like drops of rain on glass. My son's face changed slowly. First confusion, then disbelief, then the pale emptiness of realization. His hands tightened around the armrest, his lips parted, but no sound came out. The lawyer continued reading, unaffected, turning each page like turning time itself. The words were law now, not emotion. There was no argument left to make. And then came the letter, the final part of the will, the part I had written by hand, the part that was more truth than document. The lawyer opened the small envelope and unfolded the paper carefully. The handwriting was old and uneven but clear. He read aloud, "You once called me a guest in the home I built. Guests don't inherit homes. They leave when the visit is over." The words echoed in the quiet office. His wife looked down, avoiding everyone's eyes. My son sat frozen, unable to move, his breath shallow. The lawyer placed the paper on the table gently, as if laying down the final memory of a life. The silence that followed was long, the kind of silence that presses against the walls, heavy with truth. The lawyer, kind as always, spoke softly, saying that my decision was final and legally binding. The property transfer to the orphanage had already been processed. The title, the accounts, the deeds, all had been shifted months ago, during the time when my son believed I was too weak to understand paperwork. He had signed the necessary authorizations himself at the hospital, never realizing what they truly meant. For a moment, he looked as if he might speak, but words refused to come. What could he say? That love owed him wealth? That cruelty deserved inheritance? He could only stare at the papers, the black letters that carried the reflection of his own choices. His pride had been his undoing, not my revenge. His wife shifted in her seat, discomfort showing through her composure. The lawyer closed the folder and said softly that the reading was complete. My son stood slowly, his face pale, his eyes distant. The office felt too small for the weight of realization he carried. He walked out without a word, the letter still ringing in his mind like a voice he could never escape. Outside, the day was bright, almost too bright. The light fell harshly on everything, exposing what had been hidden. The same way truth exposes hearts that think they can bury guilt. He walked to his car in silence, his wife following quietly behind. The world around him looked unchanged. Cars moved, people talked, life continued. But inside him, everything had fallen apart. He drove home without speaking. The house, once his pride, now felt like an echo. Every corner, every wall, every sound reminded him of what he had lost. Not money, not property, but meaning. He entered the living room, where my photograph hung now, placed there by neighbors after my funeral. He stared at it for a long time. The woman in the frame looked calm, almost forgiving. That calmness pierced him deeper than anger ever could. He walked through the rooms in silence, his mind replaying the years he had taken for granted. The mornings I cooked his breakfast, the nights I waited for him to come home, the countless times I said nothing when words would have hurt more. He realized too late that silence is not weakness, it's warning. A silence that collects, builds, and finally speaks when words can't reach anymore. The next day, news of the will spread quietly through the neighborhood. Some pitied him, some admired my courage. People whispered about the letter, about the words "guests don't inherit homes." Some said it was harsh. Others said it was justice. But none could deny that it was fair, because in the end, love without respect deserves no reward. At the orphanage, the news brought smiles. The caretaker gathered the children and told them about the house and savings they would now receive. That same afternoon, they hung a small wooden plaque at the gate. It read, "In loving memory of Amma, who gave more than she ever received." My name carved beneath it, simple and unadorned, but alive in meaning. The sound of children laughing filled the space that once echoed with my son's indifference. The love that had been rejected had found its way home again, just in a different form. My son visited the lawyer a week later, trying to contest the will. But every paper was signed, every clause sealed, every date confirmed by his own hand. There was nothing left to undo. The lawyer told him gently that sometimes justice doesn't need permission. It only needs truth. My son left the office without a word, carrying not a document, but a lesson, one that would follow him for the rest of his life. That night, he returned to the empty house. The silence was louder than ever. He sat in my old chair, the one by the window, and stared at the garden outside. The jasmine was still blooming, untouched by his neglect. Their scent filled the room, soft and forgiving. He pressed his face into his hands, and for the first time in years tears came. Not loud, but steady, the kind that cleanse instead of destroy. He whispered my name, not expecting an answer. But somewhere, in that quiet space between guilt and grief, he heard what he had missed all along, that love never truly leaves. It just stops waiting. And so the will wasn't the will punishment. It was a mirror, a reflection of every choice, every word, every silence. A final message from a mother who had loved enough to walk away with dignity. The house no longer belonged to him, but maybe, for the first time, the lesson did. The days after the will reading moved slowly, wrapped in quiet whispers. The neighborhood spoke softly when they mentioned my name, but their tone carried respect. The house that once echoed with neglect had become a place of meaning again. People said the story of what happened had changed how they looked at family, at gratitude, at the quiet sacrifices that mothers make. My absence had done what my presence could not. It made them see. Inside that house, my photograph hung above the old wooden cabinet, surrounded by flowers. The air carried the faint scent of jasmine from the garden outside. My son walked through those rooms differently now, not with pride, but with humility. Each corner reminded him of what had been lost. He began speaking less, staying home more. The world outside that once felt like his stage had become too loud for his new silence. Some nights, he would sit by the window in my old chair, the same one I used to rest in when waiting for him to come home. The street outside glowed with faint yellow light, and the wind rustled through the trees. He would stare at the plaque that now hung near the garden wall, in loving memory of Amma. It wasn't anger that filled his eyes, it was regret. The kind that arrives too late to change anything, but early enough to live with forever. He visited the orphanage once, quietly, without telling anyone. The caretaker recognized him immediately. She showed him the children's new library, built from the money he once thought was his. The shelves were full, the walls painted bright, the air filled with laughter. He stood there, surrounded by the sound of joy, and realized this was the life his cruelty had unintentionally created. For the first time, he understood what generosity looked like, not in words, but in legacy. When he left, he donated quietly, anonymously. not out of guilt, but out of something deeper, understanding. The world has a strange way of teaching lessons through loss. The money he never inherited had built a future for others, and in doing so, had built redemption for him. He began visiting the temple again, not to pray for wealth or success, but for forgiveness. Not from me, but from himself. Back in the house, the silence changed its sound. It no longer felt empty. It felt reflective. He kept the home clean, tended to the garden, watered the jasmine every morning. The same plants that had once bloomed for me now bloomed for his repentance. He started inviting neighbors for tea, speaking softly, humbly. Some forgave him easily, others slowly, but everyone noticed that his pride had dissolved. The letter from the will stayed framed on his desk. He read it often, the line that said, "Guests don't inherit homes." Over time, he began to understand it wasn't cruelty, it was truth. Family isn't defined by birth, it's defined by behavior. And no one, not even a child, has the right to call themselves family if they treat love like debt. He learned it the way all great lessons are learned, through consequence. Years later, the house became a small symbol in the town, not for scandal, but for strength. People told their children about me, about the mother who didn't raise her voice but still made herself heard. My name became part of quiet conversations between women who found courage in my story. They said I reminded them that silence could be sharp, that kindness could still demand respect. I imagine myself now, not as a ghost haunting that house, but as a presence that lingers in its peace. My photograph doesn't need to speak. The garden, the plaque, the laughter of distant children, they all speak for me. My life didn't end in bitterness. It ended in balance. Sometimes, late at night, I imagine him sitting in that chair, the moonlight on his face, my letter in his hands. Maybe he whispers my name. Maybe he smiles faintly. Maybe he understands at last that love is not about who stays the longest. It's about who stays true. I didn't change the will to punish my son. I changed it to protect the meaning of love. Because love without respect is a wound that never closes, and respect without love is just formality. I wanted him to know both, what it means to lose one, and what it feels like to earn the other. And now, as my story finds its ending, I speak to those who are listening. The mothers, the forgotten, the silent hearts who have given more than they received. Remember this: your worth does not shrink because someone else fails to see it. Your love is not wasted because it isn't returned. The world may forget your sacrifices, but truth never does. I didn't need to raise my voice to be heard. I just needed to remind them where I came from and what I stood for. Tell me, if your own child ever called you a guest, would you still leave them your home, like subscribe and share where you're listening from? Because some stories aren't about revenge. They're about remembering what dignity sounds like.